Okay. Hi, everybody. This is a high-tech operation here. We are going to be passing a cell phone around for anybody who wants to speak. And we're going to use a second cell phone on a chair here so that we can hear people online better. So two things that we want to make sure of. One is that we're recording this meeting. So if I can just have some confirmation that it's being recorded. Yeah? Okay. Feel confident? Okay, I'm sorry, not able to see. And then secondly, if those committee members online, and it's looking like it's Arthur and Commissioner Fortman, obviously, and who else here? Senator Tipping, Juana. Those are the four. If you could make sure that you make liberal use of the raise hand function so that we make sure that we get your voices in the room and your perspectives heard. I'm going to pass it off to Commissioner Fortman so that we can see if we can hear you to make opening remarks. And we're going to be using Dylan's personal cell phone on a chair here. So give it a go.
Well, first of all, I want to applaud the creativity and innovation that this group continues to show. Welcome to this meeting. I apologize for not being there in person. I took some personal vacation, and guess what happened? I ended up getting sick. So I figured I would not share that with you. But Jason is in the room and will ably fill in for me there. I will be participating remotely, but I think I'll mostly be in listening mode because if I talk too long, I start coughing, and you don't need to hear that. But I just really appreciate the good work that has been going on, and especially want to thank my co-chair, Nancy McBrady, for keeping things moving and focused. And I just appreciate deeply all of the hard work that has gone in so far. And I look forward to today's meeting because I know we have a bunch of work ahead of us. Nancy?
Yeah, so the sound is not great. And maybe just before passing it to you, could we hear from Arthur for a moment to see if the sound quality is any different of anybody else online?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I don't know if this is any better.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Nancy McBrady. I'm the Deputy Commissioner of the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. Thank you for coming together for, I believe, our 5th meeting, if not 6th. It has certainly been a bumpy road technologically in many of our meetings. I really appreciate everyone just having good humor and rolling with it. I apologize that for everyone online who has to be on the short end of the stick, unfortunately, with this. So again, thank you for your patience. We have a lot to do today. We're starting a little bit late, obviously. I will be turning this over to Jody Sapphire, who has been a very wonderful and capable facilitator for this topic area. We have a lot to cover, and but before we do that, can we have everyone go around the table to introduce themselves? Or actually, what I'm going to do is a call on people rather than pass around this microphone. So Mike Guare, thank you for being here today. Shelley McGuire, Penny Jordan, Tom Harnett, Assistant Attorney General Ann Macri, Jody Sapphire, Jason Moyer-Lee from the Department of Labor, and the co-chair as well, physically, given Commissioner Fortman being online, Eric Venturini, Matt Schwalbaum, did I say that correctly? Thank you. Keith Miller and Heather Spalding are here in person today. Arthur Phillips is in attendance. Juana, I'm so sorry, I can't. Rodriguez is also online. Senator Mike Tipping, and obviously Commissioner Fortman just introduced herself. Did I miss anybody? I don't believe so. All right, Jody, take it away.
Great. Could we, thank you. Could we just hear from Juana and then Senator Tipping to make sure that we can hear you both?
Hi everyone, good afternoon. I'm also a little bit sick, so that's why I couldn't make it in person. So sorry about that.
Thanks for being with us.
And I hope you can hear me. And Dylan, sorry you had to deal with that. We've all been there. Thanks for working to figure that out.
Great. And then we're missing Holly today. And she has a child who's sick. So we wish her well and her child well as well. And I think that's the full committee. As Nancy said, we're trying to cover a lot today, and we'll do our best to make sure that those online can see and hear. We're going to remind ourselves of the working agreements as we do at every meeting, and we're really just, it's mostly a one big agenda item or kind of two related agenda items to have as thorough and deep a discussion about the 6 options that you all came up with at the last meeting, and any additional ideas that you've come up with since that time. And we'll kind of move from there, hopefully, understanding in greater detail some of the interests that you all have. And then we're going to move into an exercise to try to get a better understanding of the relative importance that you each feel about various parameters of what could be going into a bill. We'll make sure that we seek public input as we have at every meeting, and then we'll lay out what the next steps will be between now and 2 weeks, and there'll be quite a bit of drafting work taking place during that period. For those new to this building, there are bathrooms when you go out the left. You go out to the left, and they're on your left. And we don't have a break built in, but we'll figure that out. And for those of you who may have hopefully read the packet in detail, you'll notice that while the meeting length was said to be 1 to 4 p.m., the time allocations, I just didn't notice, and I put them at 3:30 end time, which is probably good based on when we're starting, and also that Deputy Commissioner Nick Brady has to leave at 3:30. So we're going to do our best to see where we're at 3:30 and try to wrap things up by then. We'll see how that goes. So as a reminder, we're going to end this meeting on time. We're not started on time. Thank you all for making the effort to get here, and understand those who weren't able to. Appreciate you being online and letting us see your faces, except for right this moment. Okay, and keeping your cameras on so we can see you. And we just want you to be as present and engaged while you're here as possible. We want to hear from everybody, and so just make sure that you're adding your voice to the conversation, and that you consider openly the perspectives of others. We're very much squarely in the point of this process of trying to problem solve. So the more that anybody can be floating ideas that get us in the direction of consensus, all the better. And I think we've conducted ourselves in a very civil manner up to this point, and I have all the confidence in the world that we'll continue to do that. And jokes are welcome. So with that, what we thought we would do is go through this list of 6 options that were developed at the last meeting, but not necessarily in the order in which they were listed, because some of them kind of group together more logically and have the potential, I think, to have more conversation around the details of them. They're a little bit more complex than others. So where we thought we might begin are with what we're calling 4 and 5 on the cover email that we sent to you shortly after the last meeting, and that was Eric's idea and Jeannie's idea. Where are we at with Jeannie? What happened with Jeannie?
She is traveling this week.
She was on there.
Oh, she was. Okay. 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 I'm sorry. Is she there now? Dylan? Okay, all right. Well, please. Can somebody send me those scenarios? The cover email? Yes, I'm sure we can do that. But what I'll do in the near term, while Dylan's working on a pile of other things here, is just state what they are. So Eric's idea was that in Title 26, Section 664, there would be the establishment of a minimum wage with piece rate and with a use rate exemption, and creating a separate entitlement, essentially creating a separate entitlement to minimum wage within Section 664. We acknowledge that some labor representatives on this committee found this idea inconsistent with the executive order. Jeannie's idea was somewhat similar in nature. It was to ensure payment of minimum wage, but to create an exemption for overtime and rest, leaving subchapter 3 alone, but doing this elsewhere in Title 26. So I just want to open those two up to see whether anybody came with more detail on either of those scenarios that you want to share with the group. Yeah, Tom.
I just want to ask a question.
Please.
When you were outlining Jeannie's proposal.
Yeah.
And you said without overtime, that was simply mandatory.
Sorry.
Overtime.
Yeah.
160.
Yep. Sorry, thank you. Any further thoughts that people had since the last meeting on this, on either of these? Okay. Do we want to sort of dig into those in terms of, so when, you know, after every meeting that we have this planning team that tries to figure out like what next, how can we make the next meeting most productive? And so we did that right after the last meeting, and we thought that, well, what happens if you all had all of your brilliant ideas 2 weeks ago and don't come forward with additional thoughts on these topics? So we tried to think about like, well, how would it shape, how could we shape this? And do we want to turn to that and sort of dig into those and get your perspective on that, Anne?
Sure.
Okay.
You want me to take the phone, or can people on Zoom hear me?
I love that we're passing this around like it's a religious relic. Okay, can you hear me on Zoom? Okay, I see nods, great. So I think just to sort of reiterate, the difference between these two proposals, both of them would essentially create a new entitlement to minimum wage. They would not change the overall exemption in subchapter 3. They would not change anything with respect to premium overtime pay, as opposed to limits on mandatory overtime. The difference between the two really is the location in statute. And that difference is somewhat meaningful in that they create slightly different challenges in terms of how to effectuate those different ideas. So Eric's proposal was to create the entitlement within Section 664, right? Section 664 is in subchapter 3, and it is the section of statute that already creates minimum wage. What that would do is it would create a new entitlement, but not remove the exemption from the rest of subchapter 3. And the challenge with that is that we would then have to figure out how to navigate some of those other pieces of subchapter 3, which would potentially not be applicable, which means we might have to think about repeating some of that. So for instance, record keeping. Record keeping is in a different section of subchapter 3. It's in section 665. That's the same section where the pay stub requirement is. Enforcement is in two different sections of subchapter 3. And so those would, some portion of those likely would then need to be repeated within section 664 in order to make that section enforceable for individuals employed in agriculture. So the proposal from Jeannie is a little bit more straightforward. Okay. Because it would still require probably repeating some things from subchapter 3, but you wouldn't have the potential sort of conflict or confusion within subchapter 3 because you could do it in a different place. And it would really just be a question of what pieces of subchapter 3 would need to sort of, you know, carry over, right? Enforcement, record keeping. There's probably less that would need to, because there's a lot in certain portions that aren't really relevant to farm workers. And so that part, I think, would be a little bit more straightforward. Mike?
Question.
Let's wait,
We're going to pass
be
you the.
diligent about this so that
Okay.
people online can hear your question.
Oh, in option 1, I just want to make sure I understand this. We would leave the exemption for individuals employed in agriculture that now exists in 663 there, and then have something in 664 that says essentially never mind.
That is my understanding of what Eric was proposing.
Let's pass this to Eric. I know that we're going to get good at this.
The purpose of my proposal, this is Eric from the Wild Blueberry Commission, was simply to give ag workers minimum wage, which I think a lot of people can agree to based on what the 2 different subcommittees came to the table with, and leave everything else alone, and add these 2 exemptions. So if the easier place to do that is through Jeannie's recommendation, I'm fine with that.
And we're all going to wash our hands right after this, right?
Thank you. This is Tom Harnett. So just in essence, and tell me if I'm getting this right, both of these proposals are saying yes to minimum wage, but we are still not going to consider farm workers employees under state law.
So I think we have to be a little bit careful about how we use that word employee. The exemption that is in subchapter 3, it is an exemption from subchapter 3. It does not actually change the employment relationship. It simply happens to be that that exemption is under the definition of employee. So both of these proposals would essentially create an entitlement to minimum wage that was separate and potentially located in a separate place from the minimum wage that applies to other workers, other employees.
Let me try to ask it a different way, and I hope this is helpful. It would create a farm worker minimum wage, or establish a minimum wage, which presumably will be the same, but it would not provide the same bundle of rights that other workers are entitled to under subchapter 3.
Well, I think that's one of the questions that would have to be determined, because I think those are the sort of the blanks that would need to be filled in. It would be located in a different place. We already know it would not include overtime. So the other questions and the things that would need to be filled in would be, my understanding has been that the minimum wage that we are discussing, at least for the purposes of these particular proposals, is the current state minimum wage, right? And then, you know, whether there's a piece rate exemption, what the scope of that would be, whether there's a youth wage, what the rate, what the scope would be. Those are separate pieces that would need to be fleshed out.
Thank you.
So I just want to make sure that everyone on the committee is understanding enough about the difference between those locations and the difference between those proposals and where they overlap. And we can stay on this for as long as you like in order to make sure that you understand those differences. I am heartened to hear that the person who proposed one is comfortable with the other, but just putting that out there. But other questions?
I have a follow-up question for Eric. So just following up on what you just said a minute ago. So is it just the ban on the limit on mandatory overtime and the rest breaks that you're trying to sort of sever from the minimum wage, or are there other things in subchapter 3 that you're trying to get rid of, like the record keeping's provision or the enforcement?
I guess it's just a matter of why complicate this issue. The executive order has asked us to give agricultural workers a minimum wage, and I think both of these proposals would do exactly that without adding other things on top of that the farmers would have to deal with.
Just one more follow-up. So I guess that the records keeping, one could, well, I think the idea of the way subchapter 3 is structured is that the record keeping provision and the enforcement are tied to the minimum wage, right? So you provide the right of minimum wage, but the record keeping is one of the ways that someone can establish whether they've been paid the minimum wage. And the enforcement is so that the right is real in practice and not just in theory. So I think it might be hard to separate those two. That's why I was asking if those were the things you're also trying to get rid of, or if it's the other things which are arguably less related, like rest breaks and mandatory overtime.
I suppose if I had to prioritize those things in order, then the record keeping would be, you know, as you said, the record keeping and the enforcement piece. I'd be more okay with that than the other pieces. But I'd be curious to hear what other ag groups think.
Thank you.
Senator Tipping.
Thank you. I just wondered if we gotten a response from the governor's office about whether she supports or opposes those other pieces, the voluntary rest breaks and overtime limits.
This is Nancy McBrady. Not as of yet. That is certainly not something we're going to drop in terms of ongoing conversations, but we have not received that answer as of yet.
So it's come up a few times. I think it'd be really helpful to have that, you know, if that's just an oversight and she supports that, or if she, you know, really did just want to focus on the minimum wage and not the other protections as we're making this recommendation to her office. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Should we, for the time being, move on to a couple of the other proposals from 2 weeks ago that also are linked to one another, just so that you can hear more detail about that and we can hear whether you have further ideas on that. We will be circling back to all of these concepts a little bit later. Okay? Yeah? All right. So the other two that are linked are Penny's idea of creating an agricultural compensation law that addresses minimum wage, but essentially allow for differences based on things like sector type or time sensitivity, or whether it's a seasonal versus a year-round job. And if I'm paraphrasing correctly, if we got this down last meeting correctly, it was the idea of creating a committee with and ensuring worker protections as well. Matt's follow-up comment to that idea was that this concept is essentially a form of sectoral bargaining where you have the three parties, the state, farms, and farm workers negotiate, but that you create a floor, the floor theoretically being the state minimum wage, and yet you create some flexibility within that concept based on sector. And I just was distracted by Senator Tipping. I wasn't sure if you had a comment there. So additional thoughts that you all may have brought to these two kind of related ideas. Anything that you wanted? Okay, so.
Some of the things that I thought about as I went through materials and materials from previous meetings is that, and I believe creating law at the state level is similar to creating ordinance at a local level, which that's kind of a world I live in Cape Elizabeth. And I went back to definitions, and we have multiple different types of agricultural employees. And we have an industry that has seasonal employees, but they are not necessarily seasonal businesses. And so there's that piece. And I'm not saying that our seasonal employees should not get paid minimum wage. What I'm saying is, I think in order to craft policy, anyways, this is what we do at a municipal level, in order to craft policy that is more far-reaching rather than problem-solving, you need to kind of go back to your definitions. And you go back to, you've got seasonal employees, you've got year-round ag workers, you have seasonal farm businesses, such as I think some of the blueberry farms can be considered seasonal, and they have workers that come to work on an event basis. So I start looking at how do you take and craft compensation policy around the different nuances of the industry. So you have dairy that may have larger dairy farms that may have H-2A workers. So how do we, and I know federal law takes care of H-2A, and there are some elements of that that are intriguing as you start looking at compensation from and labor from a state perspective or a non-H-2A worker perspective. So that's why I continually go back to crafting policy that works for agriculture. And as I looked at some of the materials, I go, where the impacts are going to reach or touch are mid-sized farms, larger farms. Smaller farms may not have some of the same challenges, but there's the ripple effect that's going to happen, and we know it's going to happen. We aren't naive. There are going to be other elements that are brought in future legislation. But I propose that we put the ag workers in a place where it's more separate from existing. And if it can happen based on how Eric and Jeannie have proposed, I'm a person who needs to see something in writing before I can really say, yes, that can work. But if I had my druthers, it would be a separate agricultural compensation section, totally separate. so that we can look at it in a more holistic way.
Thank you.
Thank you. Would that be in the state's labor law or in the state's agricultural law?
You're asking me a question that I don't know how to craft laws. In my heart, I would say I would need to understand the pros and cons to each one of those in order to make an informed decision. If it can sit under labor laws and still demonstrate that carve out for agricultural workers, I can support that. If it's more beneficial to farm workers and farmers to have it under ag, I would put it there. It was really interesting to me that as I read what we learned from agricultural workers, they said the same things that the farm owners were saying. Agriculture is different. It's right there. They said it. Agriculture is different. We need to be looked at differently. So to answer your question simply, I would need to see the pros and cons from people who do this for a living.
To that point, I appreciate that answer. I would have grave concern of putting labor law in the Department of Agriculture. It's conservation of forests. It's not what they do. But I'll just leave that out there.
Great, thank you. Other comments, color that you want to add to this idea that Penny surfaced originally last meeting? Yeah.
Yeah, right. This is Heather Spalding from Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, and I would generally just like to concur with what Tom shared. I guess in regards to your question, Jody, about Penny's particular proposal and Matt's suggestion that there be a floor. In either of those scenarios, we still get back to the concerns that were raised in the prior sort of couplet of scenarios. And, a big concern for me is making things more confusing and having lots of carve-outs. I feel like we, last legislative session and in the last stakeholders group, we worked really hard to streamline and pare down and narrow the focus and really compromised a lot away and learned from each other. And so I feel, and I shared this, I know I probably couldn't hear me that well in the last meeting because I was on a bus, or actually I didn't even speak. I shared comments in the chat, but my feeling is that we should, really stay the course, not create yet another category of employment law, and really avoid any more carve-outs.
In a similar nature to what we did with Anne trying to parse the first two ideas, Jason took a crack at one way of addressing Penny's idea, or some of Penny's thoughts. So why don't you go ahead with your...
Yes. So like Penny, I'm someone who likes to see things in writing. And in fact, I like to put it in writing before I present it. So I started working on what some draft legislation trying to reflect Penny's ideas might look like. It's not in a state to share today, but just some kind of broad bullet points, thinking about the points you were making and also trying to reflect the input from the farm worker subcommittee as well. So what I was looking at was the creation of a board, which might be called the Maine the Maine Farm Worker Compensation Board. which would, the structure of it could be based loosely on the Maine Agriculture Bargaining Board, which is hosted by the Department of Agriculture. This board would be hosted in the Department of Labor, not in the Department of Agriculture, and its provisions would be enforced by the Department of Labor. The way to get to the creation, and again, this is not a firm proposal, it's just some ideas about how to implement what Penny was after, I think. The way to get there would be to amend or rewrite slightly subchapter 2A of Title 26, which is entitled Employment Standards in the Forestry Industry and Farming. So right now, the farm-related material concerns farm labor contractors, so it's very narrow and limited, but there's no reason it couldn't be expanded to include this idea. So it would create a board. The board membership would consist of 3 representatives of farm workers and 3 representatives of farm employers, as well as the Director of Labor Standards and a designee of the Commissioner of the Department of Agriculture. It would leave subchapter 3 as it is. The board would have rulemaking authority to basically set employment standards for farm workers, as long as these standards are as protective as and not inconsistent with all the employment rights that farm workers currently have in statute. And to avoid a situation where setting up the board and putting people on the board and everything delays a minimum wage, the statute setting up the board would also have to set a minimum wage, which comes into effect immediately, and the board would have the power to introduce minimum wage or minimum wages above and beyond that wage if it wanted to. And there's no reason that the board couldn't have separate wage rates for different subsectors of agriculture, as long as none of these fell below the minimum wage set by the statute setting up the board. That sort of setup is very common in other parts of the world. Most of continental Europe has sectoral collective bargaining. In Australia, there's a whole series of minimum wage rates which are catered to different industries, for example. So there's nothing sort of extraordinary when you look outside of the US about it. The proposal would be to have the minimum wage rate with this piece of legislation not be the main state minimum wage rate, but the adverse effect wage rate from the H2A. So that would be $16.90 an hour currently. And it would be tied to the adverse effect wage rate, which increases annually. So in other words, the legislation would set up a minimum of that wage rate, and then this board could introduce higher rates if it wanted to for different sectors. It would also have the power to do rulemaking on other areas of employment rights for farm workers, such as overtime, such as rest breaks, such as the other areas that wouldn't be covered by this. But again, any standards that were to create would have to be as protective as what's currently in statute. It could not undo the rights that currently exist for farm workers. Right, so and then it would have to come with protections for farm workers who are exercising their rights. So part of any rights under the statute setting this up or under the regulations issued by it, as well as any rights that farm workers would have to exercise in order to implement it. So if farm workers have representatives on this board, there'd be an expectation they would consult with fellow farm workers to represent their interests, and any sort of participation by farm workers in these group meetings or in these consultations would have to be protected, or the board simply couldn't function. So that's kind of a broad overview. That would get you sort of agriculture specific, employment standards with input from farm workers and farm employers. It would take you out of subchapter 3, and it would introduce a minimum wage that's at least as high as the H2A minimum wage rate.
It's a lot to take in, but it's also consistent with much of what's been heard by both interests. So reactions to that as a concept, any feedback that you want to provide on that?
Thank you for that, and I understand, it's not, you're drafting bullet points and large issues. And I just want to make sure I'm understanding it. Are you saying that the floor would be not the current state minimum wage, but the adverse effect wage rate, and however that may change as it changes at the federal level?
Could you answer it and why?
Yes. So the way I have been drafting it is the adverse effect wage rate as it stands currently, so it changes, goes up every year, or the Maine state minimum wage rate, whichever is higher, because it's not a guarantee that it'll always be, but it probably will be. And to the answer why, because if any proposals we come up with, as the executive order has mandated us to work towards consensus, the proposals we're aiming to reflect the input from both the Farm Employer Subcommittee and the Farm Worker Subcommittee. The consistent input from the Farm Worker Subcommittee was that, going to your point about agriculture is different, they also felt agriculture is different, and for that, they should have a higher minimum wage. So if you're trying to take that on board, you need to select a higher minimum wage. The adverse effect wage rate seemed like an obvious one because it's one that many employers will already be familiar with, and it's one that's supposed to reflect, they have a whole methodology about how to establish it, which prevents us from having to redo that. It's supposed to reflect, decent employment standards.
Right.
So
And then after Penny, then.
Oh, sorry.
Actually, if it's okay, just because we
Yeah,
haven't.
go ahead.
Her yet. Thanks. Jeannie, go right ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. I was trying to find my hand raised there. I'd also like to just point out, though, with that, we did have some concerns on the youth wage. So that would have been a lower wage. And we did have some with blueberries on the piece rate. So if you're going to put in anything that was at that higher rate, so we did have some other agricultural that was at a lower wage. So I don't think that adverse wage rate is going to work for all of agriculture. So I don't think going in at a higher wage is going to work for all of agriculture. And I don't think that's going to be the consensus for all of ag.
Thank you.
I'm going to echo what Jeannie said,
You go.
and I'll hand it back to you.
You want to? No. Okay.
Yeah, because that was similar point as Jeannie. It's like addressing youth wage, addressing piecework, and being able to accommodate different compensation levels. If the floor is H2A, then to accommodate other compensation types might be a bit challenging. So I'll hand that back to you now.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that this proposal isn't claiming to address every aspect of the input from both subcommittees. That's why we're dealing with, as Jody mentioned, 6 different proposals that we're discussing now. The ones that Anne and Eric just discussed did focus on potential exemptions for piece rate or for the youth rate. So that's one sort of bucket of proposals that address some of the concerns of the Farm Employer Subcommittee. This one addresses the main concern of the Farm Worker Subcommittee, which is the wage. I appreciate it does not address, as I'm presenting it, it does not address a piece rate exemption. It does not address a youth rate. It does address taking the issue out of subchapter 3. It does address the uniqueness of agriculture. It does address the ability of farm employer representatives to have some influence over it. So that's why I said it's towards consensus. It reflects a number of the input, not 100% of it.
Only because this is your world and not mine. How does one take the input of both and create a kind of a composite recommendation?
Existential question of the last 5 months. I'm going to leave that as the rhetorical question, just because I know it wasn't. But
I just want to acknowledge, Jeannie, your hand is still up. Would you like to comment again?
I just
No.
lowered it. Sorry about that.
Okay. Heather, your hand was up. Okay. Yep. So I am still curious about the data that is driving the youth rate and the piece rate discussions. I mean, we have had presentation on the piece rate in particular, but the numbers of employees that are actually paid, that would be paid at a sub minimum wage piece rate or youth rate, I think those are still, we're just not sure. And I know that when we had the discussion about the youth rate last spring, there was very, very low numbers of youth who had actually been reported to be working on farms. And I don't know if we got updated or if it's even possible to get that data. But I do worry a bit about making exemptions for sectors where we don't have a lot of data. But on the proposal that you gave us, I appreciate hearing this. I'm curious about how the composition of the board would be appointed. Maybe you said it, maybe I just didn't get it. Would this be a gubernatorial appointment kind of thing? And what would the terms be, and how, like, I'm just thinking about, you know, I've for decades, I've been going to Board of Pesticide Control meetings, right? And it definitely makes a big difference who's populating that board and in which direction conversations are going and what kind of work they take up. And also, is this just narrow enough with enough, I guess I'm just, and I know you've got to work this out in more detail, but is this narrow enough in scope that we couldn't actually lose ground with trying to ensure that farm workers are being paid a livable wage?
All right, so the terms, that's some of the kind of mechanics, the structure of it. I was working off of the Maine Agriculture Bargaining Board, which has a completely different purpose. But I think the terms were 2 or 3 years. Maybe they can be renewed once. Just I can go back and check what it was. In terms of the narrow scope or the ability of the board to, you know, undo current rights, I think a key aspect of it is, as I mentioned before, the rulemaking power of the board they could not issue any rules which are inconsistent with statute. The board can't change statute, wouldn't have the power to change statute. So all of the employment rights that farm workers currently have, for example, in subchapter 2 around payment of wages and this type of thing, the board would have no power to undo that. It's secondary legislation effectively. So they could only build upon those rights which currently exist in statute. And the point of setting the minimum wage rate in statute also is that they can tailor minimum wages for different circumstances. They can design their own overtime provisions. But again, any rate they come up with under this proposal couldn't fall below the adverse effect wage rate. So I'm not sure, I don't see how the board could have any power to undo existing rights. It's either up or static.
Okay. And she was also asking that board, the Maine Ag Bargaining Board, is it gubernatorial appointment on that board?
Yes. So the idea would be, and this would be as well, but it would be recommendations from the farm employer side of 3 representatives with 3 alternates, and then recommendations from the farm worker side of 3 representatives with 3 alternates. So it'd be even representation, and then with 2 representatives of the state from the Department of Labor and the Department of Agriculture.
Matt, and then Heath, and then Penny.
Just a couple thoughts or dimensions on this. I mean, the overriding logic in other places that use this model of sectoral bargaining is to move competition away from low pay and low benefits. It's like if Heath is doing the right thing in the dairy industry, it's not what we want to encourage for another dairy farm to be able to, gain more market share, succeed on low pay. And obviously, like the dynamics of dairy or any of these commodity ag industries are different, right? But just so people understand the logic here is it's like, let's move competition based on productivity. Who can sort of run the best operation, who can meet the customer's need. And so that's one virtue and one logic of it. The other piece I think to think about is that it creates an ongoing tripartite structure or worker-employer structure to try and solve problems, right? So if you're a small farm, providing health insurance benefits seems like borderline impossible, right? I mean, if you're like a very small farm, right? So theoretically, I mean, most sectoral bargaining systems deal with wages, benefits, industry standards, workplace standards. So you could try to you'd have an ongoing structure to try to think about, oh my goodness, I want to provide my employees with health insurance benefits, or I want to provide this seasonal benefit to be able to attract workers into seasonal, like what's a good way to do that? Have some structure somewhat akin to this, do that, and be able to, try to find solutions. I do think that floor piece is really key. In other places where this is utilized, it's really meant to like ensure there's a floor. So, as another example, there might be like, I could imagine a lot of common ground around farm labor subcontractors in certain industries, right? Where workers have concerns about that. High road, good quality employers presumably have some concerns about that. And are there ways we can clean that up, raise standards, have mutual accountability about those systems? So, just to put more data points into the mix on this.
Thank you.
All right. So I really do love the idea of putting stakeholder groups into a situation where they could come up with what was better for the industry and the worker. But that doesn't stop the legislature from going out every winter and coming back with other laws that's going to supersede what either one of those organizations want or groups want. So that's one spot. And then as I hear us talking about this, and the adverse effect wage gets put into the conversation, I can't help but think that we're not thinking about the majority of workers in Maine that are Maine residents that have lived here and been born here and work here on farms. And I worry that we're thinking more about migrant workers than the majority of Maine farm workers. That's all I had to say.
Penny and then Shelley, and we need to plug in the phone because it's low battery.
Who is next? And then who?
You and then me.
There you go.
I'm done.
Me to go first? Okay. All right.
92%. We could switch to mine. Go ahead.
I was just going to add a couple questions into the mix as we respond to Jason's proposal. One is just around the cost that it might take to implement such a board and to kind of think through the implementation, both in terms of setting it up and the cost in terms of staff or DOL to do that, and also possible compensation for members of that board, and just recognizing the potential for slim resources within the legislature, and that might be difficult to get through if there was a piece of legislation with a hefty fiscal note. So I wanted to raise that as a potential challenge. And then the other thing that I wanted to raise is just, at least I think from our perspective in conversations with farm business owners, I wonder if this idea of moving more towards a model of sectoral bargaining might actually be more concerning to farm business owners than the original proposal that was vetoed last session. So I do just kind of want to raise that I think we're taking some of Penny's ideas and sort of morphing them with something else, which was the intention. But my sense from conversations with farmers is that this would be pretty concerning to them, because it would create kind of a slightly bureaucratic way of arriving at wage per sector. So
thank you for saying that, because I appreciate the work that you put into it, but it kind of morphed my idea into a direction that wasn't intended. And you probably knew that, because I think it doesn't actually, I think the agricultural community would probably not be extremely supportive of that. I think that what Jeannie and Eric have proposed may be the better direction at this point in time. I also go to Heath's point that we get a lot of different farm worker types that, and I go back to my definitions, we got to know who we're talking about at any point in time. And I'm a firm supporter of a youth wage, and I say that because they're entry-level jobs, they learn job skills, and I will tell you that at our farm, we do not hire them any longer because we adhere to the state minimum wage, and I can't do that with a 15-year-old. I also understand the piecework piece that we need to make sure that we continue to accommodate. So.
Let's just pause for a second. I want to see what battery we're at and whether we can switch phones.
Yeah, it's already to go.
Okay, so if I hang this up, I won't lose y'all.
Shouldn't, I gave a co-host to one of the other folks in the room too. So
Okay. Bye. Hey, can we hear you all? Why don't we hear you for a second if somebody take themselves off mute? Anybody?
Can you hear me okay?
Senator Tipping, you go right ahead.
Can you hear me okay?
You betcha. Thank you. All right, thank you. And did you have your hand up as well? Did you want to add something, Senator Tipping?
Just a policy point to what was mentioned earlier about who the adverse effect wage rate comes into effect for. And just want to make clear, it affects employees of employers with H-2A visa holders. And so right now, the entire conversation, is about other workers. That's what we're talking about in general here is workers that are not necessarily migrants, or at least not under the H-2A. Just wanted to make that clear.
Okay, thank you. Well, I want to make sure we leave time for the other two of the 6 ideas. And the next one that we thought would be helpful to cover, and these are, potentially more straightforward, either because they're simpler or you've seen them before. So we were going to move next to Juana's idea of essentially establishing a minimum wage for farm workers that's higher than the state minimum wage. And we've discussed that in the context of this last proposal, but if you took it out of that board concept and just created a minimum wage that was higher, potentially the H-2A adverse effect rate or some other higher rate, but that is essentially what Juana wanted to make sure was discussed as well. I don't know if she's on the line any longer. Dylan, are you able to see that? And Juana, if you had any further thoughts at all that you wanted to share, please feel free.
Yes, I'm still here. I didn't have any additional thoughts. I think for me, it was just hearing all the proposals were coming from the farm owners and just trying to put out the farm worker voice of what we had heard. And some of the things that I think Jason had mentioned, like we did hear farm workers mention that, yes, farm work is different and that their wage shouldn't be, it should be different, but higher, not lower than the state minimum wage.
Thank you. If it's okay, and you can tell me if it's not okay, but if it is okay to put you on the spot to just say, what is the simplest way to do that? Like, how would one go about that?
To set a higher minimum wage?
Oh, I guess I don't have a solution. I think it was more around like at least having farm workers to the minimum wage or higher. I think is what we're trying to achieve is farm workers getting a established minimum wage. And I don't know, to me, it doesn't make sense to have different minimum wages or different wages for like youth or elders or other farm workers. If what we're trying to achieve is like a minimum wage for all farm workers.
Thank you. Anything at all that you want to add?
Well, just in terms of actually, if you were trying to effectuate a higher minimum wage, I think you would just have to think about whether you create, currently our state minimum wage is indexed to inflation. So you could either set a higher minimum wage that was also indexed to inflation, so it would keep moving the way that the state minimum wage keeps moving, or you could do it as essentially sort of a differential and say whatever the state minimum wage, the agricultural minimum wage is that plus $1 or that plus 50 cents. So, you know, those would be the two most straightforward ways that I could think of to do it.
Okay, great, thank you.
I think
Any
the other,
other-
I think H2A workers, if I'm correct, are also above the minimum wage. So that could be another of adjusting it to current H2A workers, which we did hear from a lot of farmers and farm workers that farm workers are already paying that above the minimum wage. So I don't see how it would be much of a difference if we adjust it to that.
Great, thank you. Any other input on that concept? Before we briefly move on to the last one, which is the original one, which was the original bill, and any feedback that you all would like to add about that one. Any, you know, now that we've dragged you through 5 months of thought, thinking, you know, do you view that in any way different? You love it even more? You know, anything at all that you want to say about this one?
Thank you. And this is Tom Harnett. What I'm about to say about that proposal, I don't want to take away from the other proposals that have been put on the table that might be better from the perspective of farm workers. But that proposal, which was the drastically compromised bill that came out of the last legislative session, was to finally create some form of parity between farm workers and every other working person in the state of Maine. And looking at it from that perspective, I think that is a very rational thing to do, because again, we are talking about a group of workers who have been left out, left behind in basically every single labor law dealing with wages, workplace protection, collective bargaining. You can go down the list for over 100 years. None of that has changed. This would lift up that group of workers in very limited ways, but in ways that would be very significant to their day-to-day life, I think. But there have been proposals that are better than that have been discussed here. So I don't want my support to say, you know, let's not rule those out as well.
Great, thank you. Other perspectives on that? Why don't you head it that way to Shelley? And then Arthur after Shelley.
I guess I just wanted to add, it may be more of an option 7, but something that we could talk through and that it might be fruitful to talk through would be like an option 1, similar language to what was proposed in 398 last session, but with exemptions added for piece rate or a cultural practices exemption and then a youth wage. So that's something that would kind of take pieces, not all, but pieces of, I guess it's number 4, Eric's ideas, and then with option 1 from last section.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Arthur, go right ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess I think that we've learned quite a bit through this process, and I really appreciate all the work that's gone into it to gather this information. I think that one thing that I've come away with is that the importance of pay records and pay stubs for workers was not something that was highlighted in the earlier process in the first session of this legislature. And I think that that's a really critical piece of this bill. I think it's really hard to enforce wage theft if workers don't have a pay stub, if that's not a requirement. So I was happy to learn about that. And I also I think just reflecting on this process, my impression from the veto notice and the executive order was that this was an opportunity for us to really learn more about any confusion that there might have been around the bill that was vetoed at the last minute of last session. I think that we've done that. We've clarified questions. We've gone through all the different ways that farm owners and managers are already employers. And I think that we haven't heard a great deal I think that what I've heard is that there are not that many youth workers that are impacted by this proposal. There's a very small number of piece rate workers in blueberries who might be impacted by this proposal. I think that's a very small number of people, as far as I understood the presentations. And I haven't heard a great deal of, I haven't seen much evidence that I think a very relaxed protection on mandatory overtime that this would implement would represent a significant hardship on farmers. So I think that based on the executive order, I think that we've done good work. I think we've clarified a lot of the confusion that might have existed, and I would hope that we can move forward with option 1. I guess that's all I'll say for now. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. Those are very helpful comments. I also just want to mention, as we have gone through the process of looking at the various types of workers in the state, that there is a distinction to be drawn between those who are H-2A and those who are not. And it's really driven, I think, by a number of factors, but I think underlying it, H-2A is a federal program, and employers must go through the processes and procedures of applying for and receiving those workers and complying with those federal standards that set that adverse wage rate. However, there are farms in the state of Maine that choose not to go through the H-2A program, that it doesn't work for them or whatever reason presented, and therefore rely on a more local workforce or other workers that come into the state, not through H-2A. So I just want to mention that there are rubrics around the H-2A program that employers do choose to go through. And therefore, I think my overarching point is it's important to remember why that exists, how it's run, and therefore that adverse wage rate complies and applies to that federal program, whereas other employers in the state choose not to participate in it, and therefore the state minimum wage, whatever it may be at that point in time, is applicable at that point in time.
Thank you. Other feedback about option 1, what we're calling? Okay. All right.
Yeah. Can I ask some clarification? I believe that.
Thank you. Sorry, Tom.
Oh, sorry.
Pass the turkey. Pass the turkey. Thank you. Okay. I think this was in option 1 because there would be mandatory overtime limit. So here's where my brain is trying to sort because there's a knot in here. So when the question was, does this limit the amount of overtime that a farm worker can work? And it says that it was amended to bring farm workers who are not employees of seasonal employers, okay? So I'm going back to that seasonality of employees and seasonality of farms, and how many mid-sized farms and large farms do you know that are truly seasonal because they have storage products or whatever, and they operate 12 months out of the year and have cash flow 12 months out of the year, but they have seasonality from an employee perspective as they do their peak seasons and things like that. So that's why I get the angst over the overtime, having employees work more hours than at certain points because of the seasonality of the work, not the seasonality of the farm. Do you know what I mean? I'm trying to slice that.
So let me just do sort of a check on a number of things. We're at 2:30. We had two other ideas in addition to public input. One of them is just to solicit any new concepts that you had, one of which we just heard from Shelley. We want to make sure that if there are further ideas, as we suggested in our email that went out right after the last meeting, that we hear them. We want to pivot to an exercise that I think may hopefully bring a little bit of clarity around how you're viewing the relative importance of some of the parameters that we've been going through over the last 5 months. So I'm inclined to just do a check on whether there are additional new ideas beyond Shelley's that occurred to you in the last couple of weeks. Anything at all that you want to raise? Okay, just let me check with co-chairs here. I think it makes more sense to do introduce the exercise, take a break so that people can think about it, and then come back. So we'll do public input now, and then sort of switch those two. Is that right with you? Okay. Up to you, totally. Whatever you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So just before I move on, I just want to make sure we're all clear on what Shelley's proposal was, and maybe you could just, because there's a comment to another discussion, but we had it's the only new proposal that we've had. I wonder if maybe you could just reiterate it, and then maybe anyone has any follow-up questions.
Okay, go Ian. Don't have my debit card.
Thank you.
I'm buying.
Yeah, sure. So I'll reiterate, and I'm not sure Shelley's proposal makes it sound like I'm strongly advocating for this, and I'm not sure that's necessarily the case, but I'm putting it out there as an option that may sort of bring together various ideas. So what I was saying is that there could be similar language to what was introduced last session around in subchapter 3, creating that exemption or the removal of that exemption, but that there could then be language added about the exception for either piece rate work or cultural sort of practices work related to like the blueberry raking and cultural practices around blueberry raking, with the piecework piece being broader, and then if there's a desire to narrow it, maybe it being around the like sort of cultural practices piece, and or something around a use wage, an addition of a use wage, but still the sort of overall provision being within subchapter 3. So hopefully that's clear.
Yeah, so let's get comments on that. Heather first and. Need a page.
This line. Thanks, Shelley. I appreciated your raising, you're asking for clarification, because I think that I heard you say earlier that you were suggesting option 1 plus the potential exemptions for these other sectors, but option 1 was what, like in my notes, option 1 was what Eric had originally proposed, and option 2 was what Jeannie had proposed, and I just was, yeah, I just was like, I wasn't sure what option, what would be really helpful for me is if we could have like a little like maybe some kind of chart with tags under it, like very, very simple, but like that, I don't know.
And I can do that while we're letting any others. We have a follow-up question. This was in the cover email that went out just a few days after, right?
Yeah, so my quick follow-up, just trying to keep all these different options together, and bearing in mind the executive order asking us to work towards consensus. I was just wondering what out of this proposal would reflect the input from the farm workers subcommittee.
Yeah, I don't necessarily have an answer to that, Jason. I think it's a good question to raise and maybe something we can talk through more. Yeah. And hopefully, Heather, is that clear? Okay, yeah, all the numbering, and yeah, I was looking at my email when I said that.
Jeannie, go ahead. Oops, Jeannie.
Yeah, no, I'm here. I apologize earlier. We're getting a storm up here in the county, so my internet was on and off, and I missed the first part of the conversation once the audio had went on. But as far as, I guess, my standpoint, and I appreciate everybody's time that we have taken over all these meetings. The minimum wage, I understand that the pay part of that, but I guess our standpoint would still be that to be not included in that subchapter 3 due to the unintended consequences that could arise and be detrimental to the operations of agriculture in our state, just because of the uniqueness of agriculture. So we're still in that standpoint, but do understand that the minimum wage and the pay side of that.
Got it. Thank you. Okay. Heather, is that, I realize this is as cryptic as it gets, but is that enough?
Yes, it really was your cover letter of the email, but I was just kind of going back to my notes.
Yeah, sorry. We took them out of order today and we messed everybody up. Okay.
All right. And just for folks who are on the phone who can't see that, do you want to go through that, or do we?
Do you all have access to the cover email that I sent out just a few days after the last meeting? And that's where the 6 options are listed. And if you don't, we can just walk through it so you can see what's on the board. Sounds like y'all do. Okay.
And I do think it's just worth underlining that when we say the original bill, it would be in its final amended form.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
Past bill, I guess I should say. Okay, so we're gonna switch to agenda items and take public comment now, because we thought it'd be good right after that to explain this exercise that we thought could be helpful to do, and then take a break so that you can use the restroom, but also you can be thinking about the exercise during that break. So just kind of a show of hands, either both in the room and also online, for anybody who would like to be making a public comment. We have, okay, so yes, sir.
Oh, yeah.
They'll probably.
There you go.
Yes. Good afternoon, and thank you everybody for being here. I'm Senator Jeff Timberlake. I'm from Senate District 17, and I am a farmer. I haven't missed one of these meetings since the day you started. The day has probably made me, and I'm not going to beat around the bush because it's not something I do that well to begin with. It's probably made me about the sickest to my stomach as I've been since I started listening here. I'm scared for the farming industry in the state of Maine to begin with. It's in a crisis mode right now. What you're proposing is making Maine on an island that doesn't compete with the rest of the United States, say nothing about the world. It would be great if I could pay every one of my employees $20, $25 an hour. I would love to. And I don't care if I only make the $15 an hour. But right now, we don't get to dictate the price we want. We are price receivers. They tell us what we're going to get paid. Just within the last month, Hannaford has dropped the price of apples from $60 a box to $40 a box. You tell me what else in the state of Maine has gone down that much. Nothing else I buy has gone down that much. Did they drop the price in the store? No. But we have to eat it. And I have to compete against Washington State. I have to compete against Minnesota. I have to compete against New York. And they get to grow apples at a much cheaper price per bushel per acre than we do in the state of Maine. So those of you that sit around this table that have never been farmers, that have never worked out in the field, come join us for a week or a month. You may have a new attitude about how this works. We're struggling from day to day to survive. What you're proposing, I don't understand, because I've been involved in this. I'm 66 years old. I've been involved with farming since the day I was born. Has there been problems in farming over the years in the state of Maine? Back in the 70s, we could say there was maybe a problem that went around over in my neck of the woods. But as a whole, farming hasn't had a problem. And I think we're out looking for a problem that don't exist. And I'm sorry if I'm taking more time than I ever have, but it's time this gets said. We're in search of a problem that isn't there. When I listened last week about we had open meetings for farmers to come and attend and test to, but yet for employees, we didn't do that. I said, I'm a state senator. Why would we let this happen? This isn't how it works. They should have been open meetings that people had to come and attend. This is wrong. What we're doing here is very concerning to me. My only hope is that when it gets to the legislature, that it's going to get the debate it deserves and needs. And I hope the governor takes a long look at what's being proposed here. Because in all the conversations I've had, it's always been that, well, what we really want to do is just get it to the minimum wage. And now we're going beyond that. And I said, well, we could probably live with the minimum wage, but we need to have the youth wage, and we need to have a few exemptions for those that are on piecework, that are working as teams and couples, because there is some of that happens. If you just left the darn system alone, it was working and nobody was getting hurt. What we're doing is creating a program that's going to hurt some. And it's not only going to hurt the farmer, it's going to hurt the workers. Because when the farmer ain't there, the workers don't have a job. It's going away. I'm sorry, but that's my feelings. I apologize for taking up so much time.
We also have Jenny Tilton Flood on the line, And why don't you go ahead, Jenny, if we could unmute you.
Hey, I've unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. That's a huge technical accomplishment today. So, and much applause to Dylan and Tom for all their work in making sure that the public can attend this way. I just wanted to first thank everybody for providing these opportunities for us to speak at the end of these meetings and the listening sessions that were provided for both employers and for employees. I really appreciate the assistance from those that were organizing the employee listening sessions, going above and beyond and acknowledging and understanding the challenges that are present for the people doing the work within our food system, and acknowledging and understanding the hurdles and the systemic issues that prevent being able to provide opportunities for speaking like employers such as myself enjoy and can freely act in. I just wanted to be clear and state that we feel on our farm, we're a dairy farm, we utilize a skilled workforce that is year-round and is full-time. Basically, they are part of our community. The people that we work with invest their money, they pay taxes, they lift up our community, and they are raising the next generations that will do all the things that we hope the next generation does. And that makes us a little different than some of the other sectors of ag. And I've learned a lot through these sessions, and I cannot still speak for those sectors or the people working within those sectors for risk of costing them money and out of pocket. So I'm not comfortable with that. But with regards to dairy farms and year-round farms, regardless of size and number of employees, they should be required by law to pay the state minimum wage. And I feel that strongly. And that includes also keeping accurate records, providing employees with a pay statement, offering voluntary 30-minute breaks to employees after 6 hours of work, and not requiring employees to work more than 160 hours in any consecutive 2-week period, except for those emergencies that are stated by the governor or for public health or public safety or as essential public services. That would be the bare minimum that we could do. And that is the surest and only way that we can even begin to address equity and justice within our food system. And if we want to make sure that Maine doesn't remain an island, we need to make sure that Maine builds bridges. And this is one of those ways to do that. And I would highly recommend that evaluation with regards to differences and distinction amongst the sectors of ag truly be counted on and delved into. But in the short term, I hope that this committee does the work it was charged with and provides a minimum wage and floor wage for those doing the work in our food system. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Have I overlooked anyone wanting to make public comment? Okay. All right. So then I'm going to pivot us to an exercise that we'll introduce, and then we'll take a break just to allow you to think about it and then be able to provide feedback to us from each of you. And I'm hoping Arthur, you and Senator Tipping and Jeannie can do so as well from online. But what we tried to do as a planning group was identify the provisions that we've discussed, various provisions of a bill, a theoretical bill. And we're not certain that we have them all covered. So this is to get your initial feedback, first of all, that there is this question of where would this law live? So what's the location of it? And what we've done here, this code is on the left. Is it in subchapter 3 or is it out of it somewhere else? There's the wage level. To be consistent with the executive order, it's either at the minimum wage, the state minimum wage, or it's above it as option 6 suggests. there's piece rate, and all of these are either plus or minus. Is it important to you that piece rate be addressed, that you do want piece rate somehow factored into the law, or do you want to make sure it isn't?
To clarify, the plus means you want to carve out an exemption.
Yes,
From the,
yeah, you want the carve out. You want it
So that you could pay below minimum wage.
so that you could pay piece rate.
You can pay, you could pay piece rate and still have a minimum wage. Piece rate, so the minimum wage could be the floor of the piece rate.
Yeah, the idea is piece rate exemption, so you don't have to pay minimum wage
Right,
if you pay piece rate.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Or you want to make you feel strongly that there should not be an exemption, a piece rate exemption. Next one is youth wage. Similar, you do think it's important, kind of Shelley's idea, although I understand you're not necessarily the proponent of, but we're just going to call it your idea, that you love. No. And or you feel strongly that there should not be that exemption. Next is mandatory overtime. It should be included in a bill. It limits mandatory overtime limits on mandatory overtime, or you don't think it should. It should just be a simpler bill that doesn't address this issue.
So that should say limits on it.
Yes, thank you. Yep.
And piece work should say exemption.
Last two are record keeping. You do think it's important that there be record keeping. You don't think it ought to be in the bill. And then finally, rest breaks, consistent with what was consistent with subchapter 3. You do think it's important to include it. You don't. So here's the exercise. You go ahead.
They're voluntary rest breaks.
Yes, voluntary. Yep. Yep. Thank you. So the exercise is that if you each had 3 dots that you could attach to any of these on either side, where would you put them? And you could put them on 3 different things that feel most important to you, that if you only got 3, if you had a bill that at least had these 3 things, that's what's most important to you. If there's one that feels so important to you that you want to place kind of 3 dots on one, go for it. Because the other things just don't really matter all that much to you. That's not the hill that you want to die on.
So is there a default location? Because it says location.
So yeah, in subchapter 3 or outside of subchapter 3. And if we see a lot of this at the end of the day, we'll probably have some clarifying questions just to understand a little bit more better. But the thinking behind this is that it will help the 2 co-chairs to, after this meeting, be developing concepts that capture as much of what we heard as your highest priorities as possible. And in order to be able to bring that back to you in some form, not necessarily super detailed, but for your final meeting. Are there questions about what we're asking you to do? And I will, for those online, go through that again, because I understand if it's not possible for you to see that. But I want to make sure that everybody in the room understands. Senator Tipping. Senator Tipping, go right ahead. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Hold on.
Can you hear me now?
Can you try that again?
Can you hear me now? I'll switch.
Yeah, we're not hearing you well. Is there any way that you are in a different place? Something's covering up your speaker on your end? Now you're muted. Give it a try again. Unmute yourself and try that again. All right, we'll come back to you as soon as you want to try again. Just interrupt. Yeah. Go ahead.
Include the most. Sorry. Should we include the most kind of basic provision, which is just ag worker minimum wage on there?
Well, since that is the premise of the entire executive order, that's a given, I think. Yeah. That the question around wage is it at minimum wage? That's the floor. That's what you've been asked to do. Create a piece, create a recommendation that provides for minimum wage. There are some in the room who believe that it should be higher than minimum wage, and we want to understand how widespread that belief is, or how strongly you feel about that. So does that answer your question? Okay. Other clarifying questions? Go ahead, Arthur.
Thank you. I think I have these right. I can't see the board, but I'm wondering if it's possible to, or if it would be helpful to put these options as they're listed on the board in the chat here, just so we're all on the same page.
Yep.
Thank you.
We can do that. And I'm gonna, yeah, we'll figure out something. We may send you a screenshot. What we're gonna do is, once we know that all questions have been answered, we're gonna take a 5 to 10 minute break. We'll get this information to you shortly in that time. But do you have other questions? Heather? Oh, sorry. Could we do Senator Stipping first?
Yeah.
Go right ahead.
Go for it, Senator.
Thanks, and apologies for the problem there. Hopefully you can hear me now. So I'm just a little confused, and thank you for sending out the list. Maybe it'll be more obvious when we see that in visual form there. But it seems like some of these are kind of, overlapping and influence each other. I mean, I think those that want it to be under Section 3, it's not because of a deep love of that policy area, but it's because, it would include those other worker protections that are listed separately there. So it seems like a strange way to limit the dots to these specific ones in that way, but maybe I'm missing something.
No, I appreciate your point. Do you have another thought about that?
Well, I can't see the board, so I'd love to see what these are here.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, usually when you're doing democracy, it's, a bunch of equal proposals, and you're showing your support for them. And here where we have oppose, support, different things like that. I mean, it seems like maybe it should be unlimited number of dots or arranged in a different way. It might make more sense.
Somebody had a, yeah, sorry.
I'm just thinking about the mandatory overtime limit is a bit of an oxymoron, or it's kind of self-contradictory. Right. And I guess that particular one has always been kind of a tricky one to understand what we're really talking about, because it's basically an ag employer would be saying after 160 hours you have to keep working, or I would let you go. Is that, I mean, that's what the law allows at this point. I don't know. I guess I feel like we talked about this before, where there was the word that the workers are happy. They want all the hours they possibly can get. And so could we frame that as like voluntary overtime? The way I don't know. I guess it's just always been a concern.
So, and they want to jump in here too, but if I can just add 2 cents. So there's not a limit on voluntary overtime, right? So, and there, for other workers, there is a limit on no more than 80 hours of mandatory overtime in a 2-week period. The original minimum wage bill would have applied that limit to farm workers as well. So that's what we're talking about. Even if that limit applies, if a farm worker agrees to do more than that amount of overtime, they still could. The limit means the employer can't compel them to do that against their will. They can still do it voluntarily. Yeah.
I guess that means like if I were going to place a dot on either side of that, it's just the way it's framed is, sorry, is a bit confusing. Because whether I want it in or out, but you have a
get my exercise here. So I think the cleanest way to think of it is that the in this context, which is the plus sign, is you want agricultural employees to be covered by the limits on mandatory overtime section, that law, and the out or the minus sign is you don't want them to be covered by that. Does that make sense? Okay.
No, that
covers it. Okay. For those online, you already sent? Okay, so are there questions that anybody online has about this exercise? And I'm appreciating that it's not perfect and it's not, you know, to Senator Tipping's point that one could argue that by liking the idea of it being in subchapter 3, it sort of addresses a couple of these other things. I get that. And this is meant to be sort of a more general sense of the things that feel important to you, and not more than that. So I think it's entirely Commissioner Fortman and Deputy Commissioner McBrady's call as to whether you want to alter this at all in terms of structure, or we could give it a whirl.
Can I ask one clarifying question just to provide the most?
Yes, yes. We're just going to switch to Matt for a second.
Yeah, I appreciate what is being attempted here, and I think it makes lots of rational sense. Just to give the design team here the clearest data, if I put a sticker on location in, is the assumption there that I want to see limits on mandatory overtime applied, and I want to have rest breaks and record keeping? I mean, just
do I have this right?
I mean, this is Senator Tipping's question where the methodology becomes a little bit, I mean, it's essentially a.
Sorry. Might have confused you for a second here.
I think keeping it general again is more a nod towards the fact that there has been the request that minimum wage and ancillary components thereof no longer be in subchapter 3, or it stay in subchapter. So it's literally the home,
So
where it lives question. Yes, yes, because the adjacent stuff comes below.
Yeah, sorry for adding confusion to that.
I think also just another way to think about this is a broader exercise of the question I asked Eric earlier when we were talking about his proposal. Is it the record keeping that you're concerned about? Is it the enforcement? Is it the overtime? Is it the rest breaks? And when you answer that, you kind of I care more about these two than these two. That's what we're trying to establish as for the broader group, is what aspects. There's a million different ways, as we've seen today, that we could implement a minimum wage for farm workers. We've discussed many aspects of it, and I think this exercise is another attempt at trying to tease out what everyone's priorities is so that we can recommend something that aims towards consensus as much as possible.
Okay, Tom.
Can you, I'm dense here. The piece rate exemption. What do my votes mean?
want there to be the possibility of paying by piece rate. You want a piece rate exemption. Plus is there.
Okay.
So piece rate is a way of meeting minimum wage now. I think the proposal is, the plus is you want an exemption that means you do not have to meet minimum wage if you're paying by piece rate. Minus means you could still use piece rate, but piece rate would have to meet minimum wage. Is that clearer?
It is.
Okay. I'm going to make sure I don't answer the clarifying question for you. Automatic confusion. My apologies.
For those of us who support the wage level to be at threshold, if I'm understanding the exercise correctly, there's no point in putting one of our precious votes there because that's the baseline, like that's the mandate of the group. Is that correct or not correct?
No.
Well, right now there isn't.
So even though that's the executive order, like core to the executive order, if we feel strongly that there should be an at threshold minimum wage, we should spend one of our votes on that. Is that correct?
So the executive order mandates us to develop legislation for introduction in the second session of the 131st legislature that will implement a minimum wage for agricultural workers. Doesn't necessarily say the current minimum wage, doesn't say the amount. The purpose is a minimum wage. That's the essence of the executive order. So here, we're trying to understand priorities. Do you think that minimum wage should be the same minimum wage as is applied for other workers in 664? Or do you think it should be higher to reflect the input of the Farm Worker Subcommittee?
Senator Tipping.
Can you just clarify? So these pieces are on here, but some of the other proposals around sectoral bargaining or concerted activity protections and other things like that are not included to be voted on. Is there a reason for that?
Great point, Senator. I do think if we go back up to the very first line item of location, the home of where things should be, I think keeping it in section 3 would, a plus for that, for in, means the sectoral bargaining is not a concept that is being supported. And if there is an out, it is possible that sectoral bargaining could be part of an out, or it's just, again, there's a different home for all things minimum wage in agriculture. So perhaps we need to add it as so accurate. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, that seems to fly in the face of what we said, that that's simply in and out in a policy logistical thing and has no effect on the other policy pieces that rely on that.
I think it would be good to add it as the wages board, because it's one idea that would be a method of implementing the minimum wage, because out of section 3, subchapter 3 could mean different things to different people.
This is the provision you introduced earlier that we're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're going to call this wages board? Yep. Is that the best way to do that?
Shortest.
And it's plus and minus, and a net plus and minus?
Yes.
Okay. All right, again, an imperfect exercise that our hope is that it will possibly, I will say, I facilitated a process not that long ago where we tried to do something like this, and there were an equal number of dots on everything. So no guarantees here. Tom. No one vote.
Now I'm just overthinking everything. If one votes for a higher minimum wage, is that dot assuming you want it at least to be the floor? It's not really. If I want, well, I don't want, if I were to vote for a higher minimum wage, I don't want that to be interpreted as, I don't want at least the minimum wage to apply.
I think that's pretty.
The state.
The higher than secondary.
Right.
I think
But-
the point of the exercise is emphasis and prioritization.
Okay.
But I just and I mean, because we can all, I think, scrutinize this endlessly, but it's really like, it's most important to Eric that not, like that there's
a piece rate exemption. It's, most important to Matt that there's not, et cetera, just like.
All right, so I think here's what I think, is that it's clear enough, probably, to all of you. And would you feel better if you had one more theoretical dot? No, okay, so we're gonna stick with 3. And since we don't physically have dots and half of you are online, we're just gonna go person by person and just hear where you would wanna put your votes. And I'm gonna just make dots next to these. But we're gonna do that after a 5-minute break so that we get this before Nancy needs to leave at 3:30, and we're gonna try and get you all out of here early. Okay, so we'll come back at 3:15.
Yeah, I'll hold my here. I'm just gonna and whatever phone is used for
Who's the brave soul who would like to go first? Heather, go right ahead. Oh, hold on. Let's just pass it. You know what we're going to do? We're going to go right around. Yeah.
So I think this is pretty similar to what I said last week, but I think I would go with the location being in, and that there would be no piece rate exemption or youth rate exemption. And I think by having the location being in, it would allow people to take a break if they needed it after 160 hours of work in 2 weeks, and it would allow them to take a rest break after 6 hours if they wish to do so. Correct?
No, I think we were.
I know we were. So that's
Just as a separate item.
right. But I'm just putting the other two dots on piece rate and youth because I'm trying to understand. So by having the location in, it addresses those other two things that I wouldn't put dots on. But you're saying, okay. Well, I've already put my dots up there, so I don't want to take
non-erasable dots.
Okay.
So under location, I would want to be out. I would want to be out as far as piece rate and youth rate. No, I would want to be in. Yes, exemption. Yes. A youth rate. Yeah. Yes. Thanks for clarifying.
No carve out, so that means dot on piece rate minus, youth wage minus. Sorry. I guess I'll go location in. A little bit torn about that one. I don't know if I fully understand.
Location out. Piece rate exemption. And I guess I'll go youth wage.
Thank you. We're going to skip the co-chairs, and we want to just hear from the rest of you.
I want record keeping in. I want piece rate exemption out. Since we seem to have consensus on minimum wage, at least being the state, I'll leave that alone. And mandatory overtime, I want that removed. So I guess that's a plus though.
Thank you.
Okay, I have location out, piece rate exemption in, and youth rate in.
I think for me, youth wage in. Overtime, limit on mandatory overtime in. Yes. Wage board out. Also,
Thank you.
My dots would be location would be in. Piece rate exemption out. And youth wage out.
Thank you. Senator Interesting.
So I think I'm going to have to vote my fears instead of my hopes here. And I'll do 2 on no piece rate exemption, 1 on no youth wage. And I just reiterate that I think those would violate the instructions of this committee, would not be a minimum wage if we didn't have a minimum.
Thank you. Who do we still have online here? Just I can't see with the Juana, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
I was trying to ask in the chat if there was a way for us to see what you're writing.
I see how the votes are stacking up. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
I can either tell you right now.
I'm gonna jump in. This is Sean. I think we were talking just the way it's laid out in the chat was kind of confusing us with the in subject chapter 3 or out and then the rest of the list. Like I think
Sure.
that we wanted to see how it was laid out on the board. Yeah.
So one option is to take a photo and to. Yeah, let's do that so they can see. Yeah, we're going to move you all so you can see for a moment. You're still hearing us, I presume? Can anybody online tell me if you're still hearing us?
Yes.
Yes, we are.
Okay.
My face the whole time in YouTube. Okay. Are you able to watch on the opposite side?
Okay, so this is going to be backwards, so, right? And they're going to read this backwards.
Yeah, I guess that
one. Okay.
It looks fine.
We can do this.
It's not mirrored. We can see it clearly.
It only looks backwards to you.
Oh, no, really?
I think
So is that helpful, Lana?
Yes, so the dots are the votes. Is that what it is?
Yes.
Okay. And we're voting, so the location is if we want it to be located in subchapter 3.
Correct.
Okay, and then the rest, if we want it a plus or a minus, like if we want it in.
You want with, you want to say that? I'm afraid to.
They're much down through each one because they're a little bit different. So the location in or out, you want it in subchapter 3 or out of subchapter 3. The wage level, you either want it at the current minimum wage for other workers in Maine or at a higher rate. Piece rate exemption, either you want it or you don't. Youth wage, either you want a different wage for younger workers or you don't. A limit on mandatory overtime, you want it or you don't, including a provision requiring record keeping, either you want it or you don't. Voluntary rest breaks, either you want to require the employer to offer these or you don't. And the wages board, either you want it or you don't.
Okay. So we're voting on all of them.
You're offering you're telling us your 3 most important provisions that you would want to make sure.
Okay.
And you can put 3 dots on all things if you prefer. On one, I'm sorry, 3 dots on one. 3 dots on one thing if you prefer.
Okay.
Do you want us to come back to you? Do you want to think about
Yeah.
it for a moment and I'll move on to Arthur?
Yeah, if you can come back to me.
Sure.
Yeah, so I guess again, I think that the location is a little bit, I'm just recognizing that that's a little bit odd because I think those that are voting for in or out are also doing it because of how it reflects on the other issues that are referenced below. But if we're literally just talking about where in statute we're making any changes, and it has no bearing on the other pieces below, then I'll save my dot for elsewhere. I also just want to recognize that there was a piece rate exemption proposal to completely carve out piece rate from the minimum wage requirement. And there was also talk of one that would have somehow specified for those for whom the work was culturally or traditionally important. So I think that what we're talking about here is a total carve out. But I might feel differently if it were a much more limited carve out. But I would just put my dots at piece rate against a piece rate exemption, against a youth rate, and against for a limit on mandatory overtime.
Youth rate. Thank you, Arthur. Good point about the cultural piece. We didn't distinguish, and perhaps our error there. Jeannie, are you still on the line? Can we hear you?
I am.
Yeah.
Yes, on behalf of the potato industry, we are, okay with paying the state minimum wage. So the wage level, I guess, we'll just leave that one alone. And then the location is out of subchapter 3. And I think you can just put all 3 of ours on out. We're going to make that one easy for you.
Thank you. And then do we have anyone other than Juana still to ask? I think maybe not. Juana, are you all set to give us your vote?
Yeah, I have one more clarifying question. Is location in subchapter 3 eliminates all of the other things? Like if it's in chapter 3, we wouldn't have to have a piece rate exemption, a youth exemption, and all of these other things because it's already in chapter 3?
No, for the purposes of this exercise, location is only about whether you would put minimum wage in subchapter 3 or somewhere else.
But subchapter 3 already includes overtime up to 160 hours every 2 weeks, right?
But for the purposes of this exercise, we're not considering the other effects of leaving it in subchapter 3.
What effect of leaving it in subchapter 3 are we considering?
Just considering,
Just
yeah,
like minimum wage, state minimum wage, is that what we're considering?
I think it's just that it would be in subchapter 3, right? I mean, it's a little unclear. We're trying to simplify, and maybe we're not doing that, but that's how we set it up for everybody else's vote. So I think we have to maintain consistency.
Okay.
Okay.
Juana, go right
I
ahead.
would say then location would be in subchapter 3. And if it applied all of the other provisions, I would put all 3 dots there, but it sounds like it's not going to. So I would probably put the piece rate exemption out and the minimum and the youth wage out.
No, none here, Jason. Great, thank you. Did I miss anybody? Okay, all right. So at least these aren't scattered all over the map. And thank you. We'll move you back so that you can see the whole room. And I think it gives the co-chairs some guidance on what issues to make sure they address in options that they bring back to you. I understand Nancy needs to leave right now, so are there any parting words that you want to make before you leave? And then we can leave it to Jason to describe next steps.
No, I appreciate everybody's patience with this. Really, the intent today was to dig into
No.
Do you want me to?
wait, but then it, okay.
All right, I'm assuming you all can still hear me. Can I see a thumbs up? Okay, great. Just to summarize and appreciate everybody's patience, we were trying to dig into, after the end of the last meeting, ideas that had been presented about potential, potential options for minimum wage legislation going forward. Today's effort was really to tease some of those out, and this last exercise to see where prioritization might fall in particular areas. So I feel as though that has been clarified to a good degree. And I do know that in next steps, what we'll be working on is to not have a fully baked draft, here's what we're going to be recommending, but on paper, some more details about really where some of these highest priorities things have fallen and what that might look like. And then I will leave it to you all in the next few minutes to talk about when we aim to get that to you all before the final meeting, and where and how we'll be able to have dialogue about that in more detail and allow for public feedback as well.
Awesome. All right. Thank you. Thank you. So Jason had just a question about one item here. So you go ahead.
Yeah. So most of this I find unsurprising in that it reflects sort of a lot of the discussions we've had so far. I did want to ask one clarifying question, if any of the sort of the advocate side, the side that's been advocating for the farm workers, cares to answer. On the location, I think I understand, because the farm employer representatives have explained a number of times why that's a priority. I guess what I'm curious about is understanding why it ended up as a top priority for the farm worker advocate side. Bearing in mind that the location doesn't change the substantive rights and it doesn't change the enforcement, because there hasn't really been any talk of putting this in an agricultural statute. So it'd be under Department of Labor enforcement either way. So I was just curious how that ended up as a priority, if anyone wants to volunteer an answer.
For me, it was on the enforcement side and keeping this under the space of employment law and the Department of Labor. And it hasn't been fully clear to me what the out camp means by out where. If something was, so that was the logic and impetus there.
Great, thank you. Any other responses to that? Yeah.
What Matt said, but also I guess just generally not wanting to create different sectors of workers and just treating workers differently, but rather bringing everybody in and getting everybody the same minimum standards and human rights standards, wage standards, everything. So trying to have everything under in one place. Simplification.
Okay, thank you. All right. So in terms of next steps, do you want to take that?
Yeah. So what we're thinking is, based on today's discussion, the reaction to the different proposals that were made, and this exercise, the co-chairs and the working group will go away and try and come up with a few proposals that reflect the different aspects of this. Again, working towards consensus, trying to reflect the input from both sides, the priorities that we have here, and it's probably not going to be fully fleshed out, drafted legislation, but at least to have something in writing that fleshes out, between 2 and 4 proposals maybe, and we'll aim to send that around to the committee at some point before the next meeting. We'll work on it as quickly as we can, but we can't promise it'll be a week in advance. We'll get it out as quickly as we can. The idea is we're trying to, from all of the input and all of the opportunities everyone has had in this room and outside, the farm employers and the farm workers have had to input into this, start narrowing down towards what the executive order has mandated us to do, which is make recommendations. So this will be one of the last efforts to narrow that down. And at the next committee meeting, we'll have something to show you all and hear your final thoughts on it. After that, we'll go away and the co-chairs will consider those final thoughts and then make their recommendations for the governor.
Questions about that process?
So it's the co-chairs that will make the final recommendation. So will the committee be asked to vote majority and minority recommendation?
So as a reminder, in every one of your meeting packets is the working agreements, and there is a paragraph at the top of that list that explains this process of decision making. The committee's work will be guided by an aspiration to achieve consensus. Decisions regarding the final summary, findings, and recommendations will be made by the co-chairs with input from committee members and will be submitted to the governor by the co-chairs on behalf of the committee. We fully anticipated the possibility that there will not be unanimity around a perspective, that there won't be one idea that every one of you wildly supports. And so certainly a report would reflect the options that were discussed at the last meeting, but it is the prerogative of the co-chairs to decide whether they just want to present it that way to the governor, or whether they think, after hearing final input from all of you, they believe that one of those three really would be the best way to achieve this. They may put that in writing as well. But the purpose of this next meeting is to really get your final input on those options and to reflect that accurately in the final report, make it clear if there wasn't a consensus amongst all of you to share that for sure. But it's possible that the committee, the co-chairs might think that given all that, there still seems from their perspective to be the right path forward. So is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, my guess is that you're going to get this a couple days in advance of the meeting, just to give drafters the most amount of time. And it may not be a long document, so I think you'll have sufficient time to review it, but we'll do our best. Any other questions before we adjourn? Okay, thank you so much. Sorry, any other questions from those online?
Yeah, one.
Senator Tipping, sorry about that. You go right ahead.
Oh, no problem. Real quick, just a fact check from one thing we heard during the public comment portion. Just wanted to note that the 3 states mentioned as competitors to Maine all have high minimum wages, which they apply to agricultural workers, see the commissioner nodding there, as do most other states in the country.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. And Senator Tipping, my debit card is now missing, and I'm wondering if you have it.
Been accused of worse.
Have a great afternoon. Thank you for being patient online.